Ladies and gentlemen, this is Bookseller Commander-in-Chief Peter Valley here to address the great state of our bookselling nation. Welcome to the Amazon Bookselling State of the Union Address. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are threats to our homeland, but the strength of our spirit remains, and the greatness of our nation is unshaken. By the way, it has come to my attention there are imposters out there who are giving other State of the Union addresses on the television, talking about things like immigration and the economy, etc., etc. Let it be known that I am your true commander-in-chief. You know that these other people are imposters because they're talking, first of all, the biggest clue is they brag about the low state of unemployment in this nation. As you know, I ran on a platform of full unemployment by 2025. I want none of us to be working. And so when you have imposters on TV and the radio giving their, quote, State of the Union addresses, boasting about how low the unemployment rate is, that is completely at odds with my platform, and you know they're an imposter. Let's move on. Down to business, fellow countrymen. We are here for a formal appraisal of our great bookselling nation. So to further this goal of a well-rounded appraisal, let it be known I will not be discussing minutia. I will not be discussing things like new fees of the last 12 months or policy changes. None of those micro level changes. I want this State of the Union address to be an evergreen resource that can be referenced potentially for years to come. So I will only be talking about macro level developments that affect this business, not the minutia. Okay, now let's just get real. So I've shared with many of you my journey through this great bookselling nation over the years, this bookselling nation that we have built together. And so let me just recap that briefly, and it's relevant to what we're going to discuss because, as you will see, I have been present for a great swath of history of this nation that we built together. I started out in 2007, and I, at that point, was not even looking up books on a phone. I was relying just purely on blind intuition, going to garage sales and dumpsters, finding books, and then taking them home and looking them up on Amazon after I'd obtained them, and hoping that I sort of kind of got it right, and maybe every now and then I could find a profitable book. That was how I started. Then I upgraded to a flip phone where I was literally keying books manually into my little flip phone. Then I eventually upgraded to a PDA. Most of you probably don't even know what that is. It's personal something something. I forget what it stands for, but it was this giant computer-like device, bigger than any cell phone you've ever seen, that attached a barcode scanner to the end, and I would scan books that way. This is pre-smartphone. And then I graduated in 2011 or late 2010-ish. to FBA, and I also upgraded to a smartphone app, and my business exploded. Went from a part-time side hustle to a full-time profession, and that was how it remained for quite a number of years. And then at some point I truly accidentally discovered an online sourcing technique that completely took over my life, and less I was sourcing offline, and more I was sourcing online. I was not entirely comfortable with this because my roots and my heart were in the trenches, the book-selling trenches. Sourcing online felt like cheating, but it was too profitable to turn away from. And then as things progressed, I began to build the tools for this and a community around it, and things really got crazy. And before I knew it, I was personally responsible for over 1,000 people who were paying me every single month to essentially coach them on this online sourcing method. I never intended this to happen, caught me completely off guard, but what happened was, the unfortunate side effect is that my offline sourcing time began to shrink as my online sourcing students depended on me more and more, and my obligations became less and less to sourcing offline, and more to helping them, as well as my online sourcing. And so one shrunk, one expanded, and I was never entirely comfortable with that development. But again, when people are paying you to help them, you can't tell them no. So this all culminated in about 2020 when, again, I had over 1,000 people demanding a little piece of my time every day. And I was working like 15, 16 hours a day, going out of my mind to help Amazon sellers. And my offline sourcing time shrunk literally to maybe 1 day a week on the weekends. And I felt personally this was a betrayal of our Amazon bookselling nation. And I walked away from all of it. Just literally clean break, just walked away. I handed things off to other people, just walked away. So at that point in history, we're about in 2021-ish, I imagine me just sitting alone at home with no income, just crickets chirping, alone in my home, and realizing it was time to get back to the full-time book sourcing trenches. So that year represented my triumphant return to the trenches, and here we are today. But to be clear, I was never fully out of the trenches. And I tell all of this just to communicate that, again, I've been present for a large swath of Amazon Bookselling Nation history. And so what we're going to cover in the State of Union address is not just going to be developments from the last 12 months, like that imposter who gives other State of the Union addresses. This is not just going to be, again, just a recap of recent history. This is kind of me standing back, looking at the macro level trends that affect this business kind of over the last 5 years or so. And I'm going to focus on 3 specifically that cannot be ignored, because these are things that were swung into motion several years ago that are now knocking at our door and are impossible to ignore. Now, let me start out by saying, before we get into these 3 macro level trends I want to address in the State of the Union address, a lot of you are expecting discussion about things like fees and policy changes, as I mentioned. Now, I've been saying for years, addressing this nation and saying every single time that I see Amazon sellers scream that the sky is falling, it's all over, Amazon bookselling is no more, it always ends up being a false alarm. Now, there are certain, that's not to say certain things have not gotten worse over the years, because they have. But we have another year behind us, and yet another year of people screaming, oh my God, everything's over, the sky is falling. And as it turns out, once again, for about the 20th time in my Amazon selling career, things are not as bad as the original doomsday sayers had them out to be. So we saw that again over the last year with concerns about fees. And as it turns out, new fees are never great, but guess what? They were not the existential crisis that most of the naysayers said they were going to be in the Facebook groups, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm going to post a link below this video to an article that I think is fantastic, that really encapsulates recent history in terms of Amazon selling fees, breaks down the top 3 scares that we've had as Amazon booksellers, and really puts the reader at ease, does a fantastic analysis. I'll put that link below. It's not my article. I will leave that. If you came just for discussion about recent history and fees, I will leave you to just go read that article. We are here to discuss the macro. Now, allow me to recap how this business used to work. Now, this is prior to the exorbitant FBA fees that we've seen over recent years. There's been a couple waves of them. There was one in, I think the big one was 2017. So prior to this era, this is how the business used to work. You had what I would call, I never talked about this publicly, it's just kind of how I sorted things out in my head. This business had 2 revenue sources as Amazon booksellers. Number 1 was what I call the bread and butter, and the second part was called the gravy. And I'll explain each of these in detail. And this is how I looked at Amazon bookselling revenue. Okay, so the bread and butter was as follows. The bread and butter was the mainstream titles that usually had decent high demand, that you could find everywhere, that you could sell for $7, $8 in FBA and get a $3 or $4 payout all day long. So the payouts from these titles were $3 to $5, nothing too exciting. These were usually quick selling titles, and these were usually abundant. You would just see them around quite a bit. These are the books like Good to Great and the Spin Selling and the Penguin Classics. And you would just see these over and over and over again. The Malcolm Gladwell books, you would just see these all over the place. And this was in an era where you can sell a book $7, $8 FBA and get a $3 or $4 payout. If you were recent, you didn't even know this era existed. You didn't even know this was possible. Now, I don't mention all this to harken back to some bygone era of yesteryear and get nostalgic. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm just telling you the way the business used to work. So the key attributes of these bread and butter books I'm describing were they were abundant, and they were usually fast selling, and they were reliable. So that strata of an Amazon bookseller's inventory, the reason I call it the bread and butter is they paid for everything. Everything was paid for by these bread and butter titles. In other words, just the little $3 here, $4 there, they covered all your inventory costs. They covered your Amazon selling fees. They covered whatever software you were paying for. They covered all the shipping. They covered everything. They floated the entire business. Now, I'm not saying it worked out like this to the penny, obviously, but generally speaking, they covered in excess of all of your business expenses. And even though these titles weren't exactly exciting, you sell a book for $7.50, you get a $3 payout, you're not jumping for joy. But the way I looked at it was, this is keeping the business afloat. This basically allows everything else to be free money. And so you go out book sourcing, and you would come home with like 20, 30, 40, 50 of these bread and butter titles and a bunch of the gravy, which I'll talk about in a second. And you're like, that covered everything. It covered my gas. It covered all my inventory. Covered everything. It's kind of like running like a paid advertisement on Facebook or something, and then like upselling people, and then the upsell pays for your ads, and all the customers you get outside of that it's just gravy, right? It's kind of like the same concept. Okay, so next was the actual gravy. Now, these were the titles that you were selling generally for more than $7 or $8, $9. These had higher selling prices. They were usually lower demand. And these were usually niche titles that you didn't see everywhere. In fact, the what I call the gravy books were almost exclusively books that you only found one time and you never saw them again. So again, these were usually on niche subjects, usually smaller publishers, although that's not necessarily a key attribute, but usually smaller publishers, again, usually higher selling prices, and also maybe these were kind of slower sellers. They didn't average like the Malcolm Gladwell books or the Good to Greats or the Robert Kiyosaki, whatever that guy's name is, books or whatever, where like they were, ranked in like, they were selling like multiple copies a day. These usually aren't like that. The gravy titles were the ones that maybe they weren't selling immediately. Probably a good percentage would sell in the first 30 days, but maybe not even the first 30 days. You just kind of ride it out, bide your time. And when they sold, the payouts were, $7, $8, $10, $15, $20, $30 and up. I would also put textbooks in this category. And that was the money that actually went into your pocket. That was the money that paid your rent. That was the money you used to refill your paintball gun. That was the money used to buy police scanners so that you could stake out the local bank in preparation of eventually robbing it when the Amazon bookselling business collapsed, or whatever the case may be. That was the gravy, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful, harmonious ecosystem. Bread and butter and the gravy. Birds were chirping and all was well. Now, this brings us to macro trend number one. The first real main point I want to address in the State of the Union bookselling address, which is that those days sadly are gone. And what I mean specifically is that mainstream publishers are gone. They are irrelevant. They are no longer a substantial part of an Amazon bookselling business. What that means is when I'm out book sourcing and I see a book that I can assess in a split second is probably published by a mainstream publisher, I'm ignoring it completely. That never used to be the case. Now, I don't want to say 100% of the time because there are exceptions. Any book that I look at and I think, well, this is like, might have a high cover price, such as a textbook or some kind of specialized something or other, limited edition or, slipcover. So, yes, it could be from a mainstream press and still have the potential for value. But by and large, if I look at a book and I assess by the aesthetics that this is a book published by a mainstream publisher, I am tuning it out of my reality because there is simply no longer money to be made for Amazon sellers in books published by mainstream publishers. And I say this with a great degree of sorrow as your commander-in-chief. Not happy about this whatsoever. I have lots of nostalgia tied up in all those books I sold over the years, the many, probably over 100,000 that fit into this category of being a title that was very comfortable, it was very known to the masses, and it made me at least $3 payout. Those days are sadly gone. Okay, so the reason mainstream publishers are out are a combination of several factors. Number one, low cover price. Mainstream publishers, generally speaking, have a cover price that's pretty low. So to these days, when I see a book published by a mainstream publisher and I can reasonably assess it as a cover price anywhere from $30 or below, I'm going to completely tune it out. So low cover price, fact number one. Fact number two, high supply. And this is the biggest one of all. This is the killer. These books are everywhere. We used to love that they were everywhere because we could still get a minimum $3 payout. However, that's no longer the case. So the fact that they're everywhere drives the supplies up, that drives the price down into unprofitability. This is a problem that does not afflict smaller publishers and more niche titles. And then lastly, of course, the third factor that makes mainstream publishers irrelevant to us as booksellers are the fee increases that we've seen in recent years. Those three factors basically obliterate mainstream publishers from being a part of our business. Now, obviously, there's tons of exceptions, right? I already referenced that. There's certain books that can be, maybe they're recently published, so the market's not saturated yet. Mainstream titles can still make us a little bit of money, for sure. But I didn't used to just exclude them almost completely, whereas now I do. Now, I want to be clear, there is money. You can solve all problems of margin with volume. As they say, you can make up for it in volume. So the money to be made in mainstream publishers is if you're doing serious volume. So this is where sellers who are sourcing in bulk have the huge advantage here. Because if you've already got the inventory in your possession, you don't care if you're only making $1, right? So you can sell mainstream publisher books all day long and get, $1, $2 payouts. That's not a problem. Even $2 is kind of pushing it these days, but you can still eke out a little bit of money if you're buying in bulk and you're doing high volume. So that's the difference, of course, between, the bulk buying model or wholesale model and what we call the single sourcing model. If you're not familiar with the term, single sourcing is just assessing the value of an item before you bring it into your possession, before you acquire it. So most of my sourcing is still a single sourcing model. If you're doing wholesale, you're doing bulk buys, buying Gaylords, whatever the case may be, you've got a big advantage here because you can still make profit with these books. But these days, tragically, you guys, I am almost exclusively looking for titles on small publishers that have limited supply. And again, you might be sitting back being like, well, doesn't your scanner just tell you that? Like, why are you looking for anything? So I've gone on many, many rants about this. I have much content about this on fbamastery.com. But the basic idea is here, it's pre-scanning. You have to, look in the shelf of books. If you're single sourcing, you've got to be able to assess in a split second what books you're going to give attention to versus the 99% you're going to ignore. Okay, so that's what I'm referring to here. So as I'm scanning a shelf of books or a library, table of library sale, whatever the case may be, I'm looking and I'm like, all right, if it looks mainstream, it's out. If it looks niche, if it looks weird, if it looks like whoever published this does not have the publisher does not have their own art department, right? If it just looks a little bit off, a little bit weird, a little bit basic, I'm going to give those books my attention. But to put a bow on this point, these days, I am only looking for books that indicate to me they have a low supply. Very, very important detail here. Which brings us to macro trend number 2. The new money in Amazon bookselling is in operating in other sellers' blind spots. What I mean is, it's in sourcing books that other sellers are either afraid or unwilling to access. This is a huge, huge, huge survival mechanism for Amazon booksellers going forward. Now, this ties in closely to number 1, but it's not the same thing. Here's a recent example from my life. I was at a booksource and I found a textbook, and it was a, dental, I forget the term for it, not dermatology, but anyways, it's a dental textbook, dentist textbook. And I scanned it, and it was like ranked, 6 million, and it was selling for like $20. So I was like, all right, well, this is not interesting to me at all. So I put that book down, kept sourcing, and over the course of the next 20 minutes, I proceeded to find 2 other volumes of this series. And I realized, and this is something only someone who's been, around the block a few times would even pick up on, this was actually a 3-volume set. So once I had all 3 volumes together, and they were spread out in different parts of the store, different parts of the shelf, once I kind of pieced that together, I was like, I have a 3-volume set here. I actually manually looked up the set. The set is selling for $500 and was ranked like 400,000. Which, by the way, presented another interesting opportunity because I went home and I started looking up buying the individual titles and then reselling them as a set, but that's a whole separate conversation. So I was willing to do something that other booksellers had overlooked because they were lazy or because they just didn't know. And more and more and more, the books that I'm sourcing are books that I can clearly look at and go, there's a reason that other Amazon sellers have not gotten this book before I did. Now, the reason why I say the new money is in other sellers' blind spots is not because I'm buying into the hype around Amazon selling is saturated. I don't buy into that at all. I've not seen, if anything, I think number of Amazon booksellers has gone down in recent years. So that's not why I'm saying this. I'm not saying because competition is so fierce, you've got to work in the other sellers' blind spots. That's actually not my point here. My point here is that because the easy money has been eroded by the increase in fees in the last number of years, the easy money being those bread and butter books I talked about before, that now we have to be willing to go more and more where other sellers are unwilling to go. So yes, it's about bundling. It's about, really the biggest one here is about being willing to look up books manually or scan with OCR books that don't have a barcode. That is a massive, massive advantage for sellers going forward. And I'm not worried about this catching on or every Amazon seller doing this because most Amazon sellers are lazy, number 1. Number 2, most Amazon sellers have no idea what to look for when it comes to spotting value, which is a fantastic thing because if you went and started looking up every single book without a barcode manually, you would basically turn 90 years old before you got to your 100th profitable book because it just doesn't work. It takes too much time. So you've got to be able to spot value. And again, that takes many forms. I'm talking about keying in books manually. I'm talking about book bundling. I'm talking about also looking at books that have missing dust jackets. I'm talking about pre-ISBN books. I'm talking about scratching off stickers, price stickers from sources that cover up barcodes. I'm talking about social sourcing. I'm talking about accessing inventory that you actually have to talk to people to get access to. There's a whole list of ways to source inventory that other Amazon sellers are simply not willing to do because it involves anything other than just picking something up that's right in front of you and scanning it. If it requires any more effort than that, the average Amazon seller is simply unwilling or unable to do it. And this represents a huge opportunity for the rest of us. And I want to be clear, there's still plenty of money to be made with the low-hanging fruit, with the easily accessible books. I'm not saying you got to dress up like Indiana Jones and start, spelunking through caves to find profit. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is you get a massive advantage in this day and age, in the state of our great union, Amazon bookselling nation that we built together. You have a massive, massive advantage over everybody else if you're willing to do things other sellers aren't willing to do. This used to be optional. Now, here's what I noticed about different fields and areas and whatever, whether it's like crypto or whatever. There's always people screaming that trouble is coming and here's what you should do to prepare for it. And then there's the 99.5% of people in that area, in that field, in that niche that sort of just go, oh, whatever. That guy in his soapbox, quiet down, you're being dramatic, right? So for a recent example, search engine optimization. Don't worry, I'm not gonna go a big boring speech about search engine optimization, but the science of getting your website ranked high in the search results, right? So for a while now, a couple years, people have been saying quietly, you've got to be careful about populating your website with AI generated content. Because even though Google allows it, one day the smackdown will come. And everybody was like, oh, everyone in that world, which I'm not in that world, but I loosely follow it. They were like, oh, whatever, these Luddites, just tell them to go away. They'll shut up. And they were spitting out websites with 10,000 pages every single day. It was all AI generated. And then what happened recently? Google brought the smackdown. And the people that were looked at as crazy and paranoid got the last laugh. So what I have been saying personally for years is you have got to school yourself in capitalizing on blind spots, learning things that other sellers are unwilling to learn or too lazy to learn, doing things that other sellers are unwilling to do and too lazy to do. That used to be optional and it used to just make you more money. Now it is absolutely mandatory. Which brings us to macro market force number 3. You now, today, in this current state of our union, must either source smarter or make up for it in volume. You've got 2 options here. Now, once again, closely related to the first 2 things we just covered, but not the same. So what do I mean by source smarter? Sourcing smarter means what I just referenced a second ago. It also just means ruthlessly, militantly seeking out new ways to source inventory. The average Amazon seller sits back and they're like, these are my sources. I've got these 10 sources in my area and those are my sources. Most Amazon sellers do not spend a significant amount of time discovering new sources. Source discovery is not considered a mandatory part of this business, whereas today it is. You must be constantly forging forward, finding new creative inventory sources. That means getting out of your comfort zone. It might mean picking up the phone. It might mean doing things that not every single other Amazon seller is doing in these Facebook groups or all the other tactics that are just not necessarily tapped out, because none of them are. Even the low-hanging fruit sources are fine. I was at a library book sale like 10 days ago and it was well advertised. And guess what? I made plenty of money. So I'm not saying the profits all dried up and you have to just, bushwhack your way to uncharted territory. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying you've got 2 options: sourcing smarter, constantly discovering new sources, new ways to source inventory, or make up for it in volume. And that means just simply acquiring more, lowering your standards, number 1, and acquiring more inventory, selling for lower payouts. Because as I said earlier, volume cures all. If you decide you just want to triple down on your usual sources and just lower your standards and just start acquiring a lot more inventory and selling it for lower margins, lower payouts, that is also an option for you. I mean, even bulk sellers are feeling the squeeze these days. A lot of them have dropped out of the business because of increased fees. They were already operating on, 50 cent profit per book. And then when they got squeezed out, a lot of them just dropped out. Again, what used to be optional is no longer optional. So you do have the option of lowering your standards. And believe me, I think about this every day. My $3 payout threshold, I've held to that almost since day 1 of my involvement in this business. It can be painful leaving behind so many $2 books and $1 books. So even if I'm not doing that, you may decide to do that, or you also have the option of sourcing smarter. And I'm leaving this to your own creativity here. There's lots of resources out there. You don't need to go buy a course. Basically, anything you can care to learn is out there on the internet somewhere. There's someone talking about just about every form of book sourcing there is out there. None of this is locked in a vault only known by the elite few. The information's all out there. It's just a matter of, are you willing to do things other sellers aren't willing to do, or get outside of your own comfort zone? Fellow countrymen, countrywomen, allow me to bring this State of the Union address to a very empowering close. None of this, nothing I've talked about here today, none of the challenges and tribulations that affect our great nation are hard. None of this is hard. And as I said, people have been saying for years, couple things. The easy money is going to go away eventually. And I'm not saying it even, it's still the easiest money out there, right? This business we're in is still inherently in its DNA, easy money. Books are everywhere. So it's easy money, but the easy money, that's diminished somewhat, okay? But none of this is hard. A couple things I'm going to leave you with. This is your to-do list. You ready? Going forward, marching forward into the new generation that we stand at the threshold of. Number one, make new source discovery a part of your business. In other words, don't just sit back and go, these are my sources. Ask yourself, what new sources have I discovered this month? And you're never going to run out completely. You will get really, really high returns on asking that question for a while. And it's true, eventually those returns will start to diminish. There is a theoretical ceiling on, not necessarily the number of individual sources, but the number of categories of sources that you could explore, right? But start making source discovery a absolutely mandatory part of your business. Number two, start learning how to spot value. I know this seems weird. People always roll their eyes when I talk about this. Spotting value means learning how to tell that a book has a high likelihood of value before you pick up your scanner. This is an absolutely mandatory skill to have as we march forward into the new period ahead of us. Absolutely mandatory. I've been talking about it for a lot of years. Just like the people screaming about don't use AI on your websites, the day has come. We are here. You must learn this skill. I've got plenty of articles that teach this, not plenty, a couple on fbamastery.com. Strongly recommend you check those out. I've got one called The 4 Laws of Value that is just like, I think the best thing I've ever written. It's also one of the longest things I've ever written. So read that article. I'll probably link it below. And the last thing I'll say, as the Commander-in-Chief, I want to remind everyone in this great nation why we're here to begin with. Why did we choose books? Why aren't we selling candy bars? Why did we choose books? Let's do a little refresher. Number one, they're abundant. Number two, they're cheap, meaning low perceived value. Number three, high margins. And the margins are still there. Just because the fees have gone up in the last 5-6 years does not mean the margins are eroded. There's still drug dealer level margins. But going forward, the smart money is still in the easy money. It's just the slightly less easy money. That's it. Fellow Amazon sellers, our great book selling nation is resilient. It remains proud, and all glory be to this, the greatest business on earth. Amen. Oh, one more thing. As the Commander Bookseller in Chief, I have signed an executive order that you must go download my free 396-page book, like literally right now. Go to fbamastery.com. You'll see a place to sign up for it. Enter your email address. You can download it instantly. It's literally 396 pages. It's literally the most insane thing I've ever seen given away for free in the Amazon selling world. So go do that right now. And again, this is an executive order. So the National Guard is standing by. They will actually take you in to custody and put you before a military tribunal if you don't go download it. And I'm the Commander-in-Chief, so I get to do things like that. So I'm not a benevolent dictator. I'm actually a malevolent dictator. So go do that right now, and you don't want to see my ugly side. 396 pages. Reselling for Rebels is what it's called. And just go check it out. All right, I'll see you guys over there, or I guess in Guantanamo. Either way.